academy setting, how do you try to recreate the situations that officers can be in where there would be a deadly force situation? Obviously there's so many different variables on, what that can look like in the real world, but how do you try to prepare them as best as you can with scenarios?
That's a very good question. There's a lot of different factors, and it's a foundational or an evolutionary process when we start training individuals to do this. And the thing is, we have to recognize that it's anything in public safety. It doesn't matter if we're talking EMS, if we're talking the fire services. It is absolutely 100% impossible to duplicate what it's going to be like out on the street. However, with that said, we try to make it as realistic as we possibly can. So the process starts essentially where you have to first, before we can even get to that scenario-based training, we have to learn the legal requirements, the foundation. When can you use deadly force? What are the requirements? What are the factors that contribute to that decision? You have to master that first before we can ever move on to that practical application. And the first part of that practical application is the actual marksmanship and the safety with a firearm. Okay? Once we've progressed through that and we've recognized that that student meets that requisite level of safety and proficiency, we then go to the scenario-based training. Now, with the scenario-based training, there's different ways in which we can do this. But the most effective is we equip the students in protective gear. We equip the students in what's referred to as an NLTA, non-lethal training ammunition, safety devices such as a helmet, a neck guard, gloves, and body armor. And then we provide them a firearm, and that firearm is actually a functioning firearm. It shoots a paint projectile, okay? And we send them into an actual scenario. They have a radio. We dispatch them in a similar fashion to what they would be dispatched in a real-life setting, all right? Well, maybe, for instance, you have a noise complaint at 341 Highway 18 East, all right? Same information that they would get. We then send them into this scenario, and in that scenario, they have a live role player who is also equipped with protective equipment. Now, these scenarios, how it's going to play out is really going to be directly related to how the student performs. The problem that we run into, and this is anywhere, not just in Grant County, not just in Wisconsin, is the thing that we cannot duplicate. The students know it's a training exercise. They understand that. Okay, they understand it's a training exercise. They understand that when it's said and done, all right, it's pass-fail. It's a pass-fail situation. The worst thing that's going to happen is they're going to walk out the door safely. Okay? Yes, there's stress associated with it. But having been an officer myself, we can never mimic the stress of what you have out on the street. Where at that quarter of a second or less, you're making a life or death decision that's going to impact your career, possibly your life, the lives of those around you, including the person you're dealing with. You can't duplicate stress like that.
How do you marry that to the fact that you have to make a split-second decision where you might not, if you keep thinking about, what else can I do right now, maybe that's the difference between you getting shot or, somebody else getting injured.
I think one of the things that, and I think a lot of frustration from the public, and I understand this, because I think a lot of the frustration is the majority of the people in the public really do not understand what the rules are that we operate under as far as the use of force. They don't have a true understanding of what criteria we look like, what are those situations. And furthermore, it's simply put, we're not going to be perfect. We're humans, okay? Law enforcement officers are humans dealing with other humans, often under a great deal of duress, in chaotic situations, rapidly changing with very little information, okay? People make mistakes, both sides of the fence, okay? The people that we deal with, and then officers, we make mistakes, okay? And I think at some point, some of the disconnect is realizing when there was a situation that was so chaotic where officers are making decisions within fractions of a second based upon the information they have in front of them. It's easy to look at it in hindsight and sit and analyze video and to analyze security camera footage and all these different evidentiary items after the fact, but to understand in a moment when an officer, maybe your camera is catching this whole view. An officer, you have, I believe, about 7 degrees that you can actually focus. Okay, so if I'm looking at this camera, I can't see you. Okay, so you look at all these human factors that come into that use of force, and that's really quite a challenge as to how to address those issues.
A lot of planning that went into trying to, like I said, take him in as safely as possible, minimal impact. It's never a perfect situation for officers when they're going out there and trying to arrest somebody. But what are some of the concerns you have? We were out there yesterday in an area where he lives. There's a cluster of quite a few houses in that area. What layer does that add to the situation where you have a lot of people living in that area, and he's made those comments?
Well, again, it goes back to them making the decision to try and stop him in his vehicle, to be away from all of that. So again, that plays another role as to why we wanted him away from his residence and in his vehicle and stopped on a traffic stop. Yep, that was part of it.
And I realize this isn't the ideal comparison. This isn't a perfect comparison here, but I think one of the watershed moments in American law enforcement history that really kind of dictated how we look at certain situations. If you remember back in the early 90s with Waco, Texas, and the standoff with the FBI and the Branch Davidians. Mm-hmm. If you go back, and I'm not trying to Monday morning quarterback anyone. I obviously I was in middle school at that time. I wasn't obviously part of the law enforcement profession at that time. But I think that made everybody that's in law enforcement take a pause and say, what? Is there a better way that we could have done that? Is there a different way that we could have done this? Because that individual was in his home with weapons. It was fortified, all right? The law enforcement officers were going into a situation where the suspect had all the advantages. Law enforcement did not. Law enforcement, I believe they sent out in the 70s, the number of agents they sent out to conduct that particular warrant service. And the simple question is, with Mr. Kretsch going into Waco, Texas several times during the week, wouldn't a traffic stop have been a better solution than what we encountered there?
Sure.
And that's one of the things we look at is which is, again, it's the risk versus reward analysis that we use a lot of times in public safety. Is the risk we're taking worth the apprehension? All right? If you look at police pursuits, one of the questions we always have to ask is, in any police pursuit, does the risk outweigh the benefit of apprehending this person? Okay, and if the risk is too great, why are we pursuing? Same sort of situation here. Is there an alternative that's safer? And in this particular situation, looking at perhaps being able to take an individual in custody on a traffic stop is a preference in a situation similar to this than maybe going up and trying to do that warrant service at the house.
That somebody that you're going to be serving has made statements that they're going to be a danger, just the nature of the job being unpredictable. What did that, it sounded like it meant something to the officers, obviously, in terms of preparation, knowing ahead of time that this person made statements that they would potentially harm law enforcement, that they, this person, I guess, considered a sovereign citizen of sorts. What does that mean to the preparation? That you can have that information ahead of time, that you're walking into something that could be potentially dangerous.
And I think that goes back to what Tom just mentioned about experience, in that as you do this job more, you start to understand that even though you might go into a situation and think, oh, okay, I've dealt with something like this before, but just that little bit of information that makes you think a little bit more, and your experience says, no, I know now that this little bit of threat has been made, that I need to be better prepared going into this call. And again, it comes with experience. In this case, it was the officer was given information that there were some statements that were made. I mean, you don't know if they're true, if they're not, if it's just blowing smoke, whatever. But we have to be prepared for anything. So the officer and the deputy, made sure that he was prepared should something happen. And it's not uncommon. I mean, what he did and how he prepared for this call is not something that's not done. It's done fairly regular. Any type of call, domestics and all different kinds of calls are very dangerous, and you just never know what to expect. So you always have to be prepared.